to introduce to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center the author of the weekly feature, Who's Hot and Who's Not. Russ Moore, welcome, sir.
All right, Josh, what's going on, my friend?
So it's been a busy week. You know, we should have been done with the legislature months ago, but in fact,
we had a lot of news this week.
They made a lot of news this week. And before we jump into who is hot and who is not, it seems like it was a pretty big year for progressives in their legislative agenda, and we'll talk about them in a second, but
sure,
this was not a big pro-business year up at the Rhode Island General Assembly.
That's a really interesting point, and I think you're exactly right. I mean, we saw some legislation that was anti-gun, to be frank, legislation to protect domestic violence victims. That's certainly a progressive piece of legislation. We saw the whole justice reinvestment package, which is very progressive, not the law and order type legislation that more conservatives or moderates like. So there were certainly a lot of things that passed that were definitely progressive, and I think it's a sign of the times. We've seen progressive candidates prevail on the local level in special elections, and I think it's fair to say that the body has taken a slight step to the left, to the more progressive side of things.
And what does that mean for the future of Nick Mattiello and Dominic Ruggiero, two kind of old school conservative elected officials? Is that do they need to adapt, or can they adapt quick enough to meet their bodies?
I think you're right. I think they are adapting. I think what we saw this year is an attempt to adapt to that, because if there's one thing politicians care about more than anything, it's getting elected and reelected. And not only elected in their districts, but also elected to the leadership positions they may hold in the legislature. So I think the fact that we saw some more progressive pieces of legislation this year than we have in previous years is a testament to that fact.
Let's go to the list.
All right, let's do it.
Speaking of the agenda, Aaron Ruggenberg,
sure.
He was hot.
He was hot. He's probably the legislature's most progressive representative. I mean, you could probably argue there's someone maybe who's just as progressive, but I don't think there's anyone more progressive than him, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but he certainly was victorious in some of the pieces of legislation that he was spearheading or championing. None more important to him than the earned sick time legislation that he finally saw passed, that he worked hard for.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we came out editorially in favor of that legislation. That one's a little bit of a pro-labor vote, but it's also just a good public health issue.
Absolutely.
I don't understand why you want sick people coming in to
your
your restaurant to serve people.
Yeah, if I'm going into Dunkin' Donuts, I don't want the girl or the gentleman behind the counter covering his mouth and coughing or sweating from a fever. I think it's a pro-health legislation. I thought it was a good piece of legislation, and I think he deserves credit for passing it. But, you know, he saw some other pieces of legislation that he supported pass, and I think it gives him a strong headwind to kind of run behind as he embarks on this race for lieutenant governor, which by all accounts it seems like he's going to be making. I'd be surprised if he doesn't. So
he's a young guy. He's in his mid-20s. He's right out of Brown University, but he's got $180,000 sitting in the bank, and
he can get more.
And he can get a lot more.
Right.
He can fundraise. He's a very aggressive fundraiser. He's a very aggressive young politician. Can he take on a Dan McKee? Well, I'm sure we'll revisit this 50 times over the next year. Can he take out Dan McKee in a primary?
Yes, he can. That's not a prediction that he will, but you asked me if he could, and I would say yes, and I think Lieutenant Governor McKee realizes this, so I would expect to see the Lieutenant Governor get a lot more aggressive in his office and his campaigning in the next 6 months to a year.
It's funny, in the first two and a half years in office, we did not receive a single press release, not one, from Dan McKee. Right. And I would say in the last 6 months to a year, we probably... I
bet you've gotten a lot.
Yeah, thank God we're paperless here. We would have killed off all the Northwest forests in the United States if that was the case.
So he's taking it seriously.
Yeah. Let's talk Patricia Morgan. The Republicans, are always trying to get some footing up at the General Assembly. Patricia Morgan, I think, fights the good fight pretty much every day.
And I think she's right on a lot of the issues. I'm not saying that she's on the hot list because she made any legislative headway or they're going to win more seats, but on some of the issues, she is spot on. And no issue is more indicative of that than the moral obligation issue.
Yeah.
She is 100% right that whether we want to do a stadium deal or not, we should not be using moral obligation bonds. And furthermore, and we'll get into moral obligation bonds a little bit later, but furthermore, she also deserves credit for pushing this issue of whether we should go before the voters for a stadium deal. If we're going to spend taxpayer money on it, shouldn't it go before the voters in a general obligation bond, just like we would if we were going to expand a public park in Bristol or in Warwick or in Newport? And I think
yeah, I
she's
mean,
right.
Gary Sass on Monday on his segment on Business Monday, he talks about that at a minimum, the General Assembly needs to approve it by a 2/3 vote because of the requirements in the state's constitution. So there's a
Good
lot
point.
of forces to be had here. Patricia Morgan's looking like she might run for the Republican nomination to be the next governor. There's Joe Trillo, there's Alan Fung,
Sure.
there's Giovanni Ferrosi,
Ferrosi, yeah.
there's Patricia Morgan. Just an early handicap. We're not going to hold this
All right.
segment over your head.
All right.
But how does that break with the four of them?
I think that Mayor Fung is going to be very formidable in seeking this nomination. He came really close to winning the governor's race in 2014, and I think that, may he rest in peace, but if Mr. Healy hadn't have run, I think you could make the argument that Allen would be the governor right now. So I think Republicans are going to kind of look at this, and some of them may say that they're more ideologically aligned with someone like Patricia Morgan or maybe someone like Joe Trillo, but I think that at the end of the day, I think that they're going to want to side with Alan Fung because I think he has the best chance to win and he's got the executive experience. I think those are two things. A lot of people forget that to be governor, it's not just an ideological position. You need to be able to run an organization. He's proven that in Cranston certainly for a number of years. So I think
And
he's
Cranston's
a
pretty
strong,
hot right now. I mean,
Yeah,
Garden
they've got
City,
a lot going on.
Garden City's exploding. Chapel across the street. I mean, there's a lot of very good economic development. He's got a good story to tell.
He absolutely does, and I certainly would never want to discourage someone like Patricia Morgan from running because she adds to the conversation and she's very intelligent. But I do think that she will be a long shot candidate, but I still think that long shot candidates sometimes do prevail.
She ran for lieutenant governor. Would she beat Dan McKee? Would she beat Aaron Ruggenberg?
I think that would be tough too because I think that the midterms are tough for Republicans, so I think she'd have that working against her. But I think she'd have a better chance.
Teresa Tanzi.
Sure. Again, you started off this broadcast by saying that it's been a good year for progressives, and again, it certainly was. So I've got Teresa Tanzi on the hot list. She's certainly, every bit as progressive as anyone there, almost, I'd say, an equal to perhaps Representative Regenberg. And she really has been working on this bill that would get guns out of the hands of people accused of and convicted of domestic violence.
Must be convicted of.
Must be convicted of domestic violence. And she was successful in getting that bill passed. It's been a bill
over the objection of the NRA, over the objection of a speaker, maybe not an objection, but a speaker who has an A rating from the NRA.
from the NRA.
So that was a heavy lift, not easily done, degree of difficulty 10.0.
And the Senate is rather pro-gun as well.
Yeah.
People don't understand it, but the Senate's actually pro-gun too. So she was able to get it through the House, get it through the Senate, and I think it's a good bill. I don't think people convicted of domestic violence should own guns. So I think it was a good bill that she passed. I know a lot of people, talk about the Second Amendment, and they have some strong arguments. But in this case, I thought it was a good piece of legislation that, on balance, protects our citizens. So I wanted to give her a shout out and make her hot for this week here.
Representative Jim Langevin. Washington is in complete, utter chaos. Depending on the day, we literally don't know what turmoil there could possibly be. Nothing gets passed.
Nothing.
It's hard to blame Trump for his legislative initiative because nothing has passed.
Right.
Literally, not a single bill
That is
other
true.
than a Supreme Court justice.
And yet, despite all that, I have a representative from the minority party on the hot list. And look, the reason I put him on the hot list is because he used his bully pulpit to bring attention to the importance of protecting consumer data. And I think that's very important right about now, given the fact that we've got this Equifax disaster with the data breach and people's credit report history has been compromised. So Representative Langevin wants to create protocol to notify people when their credit has been compromised so that they can take steps to protect themselves.
I'll also say, as I think most people know, we have a GoLocal in Massachusetts. so we see the data coming out and the announcements. Senator Elizabeth Warren has also been an absolute pit bull on this issue.
Absolutely.
And on Equifax. Let's jump over a little oyster festival.
Sure.
going on.
Over here on South Water Street, we're going to have an oyster festival tomorrow to try to bring attention to the state's aquaculture industry, and the money will go to benefit that industry. It's one of our state's big economic development attractions. Everyone likes to come here and have our seafood, and oysters in Rhode Island are the best anywhere in the country, probably the best anywhere in the world. So I think it's a nice little celebration that we should have, and we should attend if we can get down there.
So a lot of discussion about the Paw Sox. I'm going to hold off on that because usually the Paw Sox go as the Red Sox go. The Red Sox are in first place.
Right.
Their attendance is, I believe, down. Their TV ratings are down significantly. It took me till the other morning over at the Dunkin' Donuts here on the corner to hear 3 older codgers talking about baseball, and it just hit me like a freight train. That's the first time I've heard anybody in a public place talking about baseball versus 10 or 20 years ago. The Red Sox are in first place. That's all we would be talking about.
That's a great point, Josh. I agree 100%. Baseball is definitely a dying game. It's done itself no favors on the business side of things. It's not adapting to a on-demand world where things happen quickly. The game takes forever. It's if anything, it's done things to slow down the game with this ridiculous replay. All that being said, I totally agree that that's not hot. The team itself is playing really well. They're in first place. They're going to be in the playoffs. When the playoffs start, Josh, people will be talking about baseball again. I guarantee that. So it's just the actual performance of the team on the field that compelled me to put them on the hot list because they're up by 3 games with 9 games left.
Now,
They're going to win the division.
Let me just make one comment. I am a lacrosse biased person. Played lacrosse, coached lacrosse. My son plays in college. But let me just tell you a story.
And that is growing in popularity.
We were switching channels one time between a Red Sox game and a Boston Cannons lacrosse game. Between pitches of a Red Sox player, 3 goals were scored in the professional lacrosse game.
And that explains, I think, really well why lacrosse is just booming in popularity. I hear so many. I have a much younger brother who just graduated high school a couple of years ago, and I was astonished at how many youngsters his age were getting involved in lacrosse, are interested in lacrosse as opposed to baseball, and that's common all across the country for that reason.
Not on your list, but let's skip over it. Let's go to the not hot
Sure.
list. Gina Raimondo. Another tough week for Gina Raimondo.
I had no choice but to put the governor on the not hot list because she sent out a directive, as GoLocal broke the story, to her public relations people, her spokespeople, forcing them to arrange press conferences to talk about good things that are happening in their department.
On her 1,000th day.
On her 1,000th day. That is a misuse of state resources. The spokespeople that work for the state are there to give us information that we want, whether it's the press or the public. It's not there to make the governor look good. We're not paying these people to make the governor look good. If she wants to do that, hire a campaign team, pay them out of your campaign fund. Don't use the state's resources to do that. It's not a propaganda department, nor should it be.
It was one of the most clumsy, awkward, icky, I'm going to use the word icky if there's a technical definition to
Right.
it, that I've seen in a long time in politics. And I think it kind of creeped a lot of people out that on this monumental day, Gina Raimondo's 1,000th day in office, which had a sort of Roman Empire-esque
Or a Kim Jong-un-esque
Yeah, that's right.
taste to it. I mean, and you couldn't read that story in GoLocal. I think it was one day we came out with it. You couldn't read that and not get angry. I was perturbed after reading that, not only as a journalist, but as just a resident of Rhode Island who paid taxes.
Let me tell you, as a news organization, when you get one of those leaked over to you, it is like Christmas in April. Donna Nesselbush, not
hot.
Why?
No, Donna Nesselbush is not hot. Donna Nesselbush should not be acting like a cheerleader for the Pawtucket Red Sox Stadium. Standing at a podium screaming out, "If you build it, they will come," is not sound economic advice. That's from a movie called Field of Dreams, which, oh, by the way, Senator Nesselbush, is a fairy tale. So you're quoting a movie that's a fairy tale and saying it as if it's sound economic advice. I'm sorry, that is not how we roll. We may need to build a stadium, or the people of Rhode Island may think it's a good idea, but not for that reason, if there is one.
Moral obligation bonds, obviously, we had a story this week taking analysis at the language that was in 38 studios and comparing it to the language that was in the draft legislation that's now before the legislature for the funding of the new stadium in Pawtucket. The language is de facto identical. It puts the complete burden. And did we learn, is it, we just can't learn a
All right.
good lesson?
So I said I got angry when I read about the governor's propaganda directive. I got even just as angry, if not more, when I read that we're going to use moral obligation bonds. If there's anything we learned from the 38 Studios fiasco, it is not to use moral obligation bonds. Because if those obligation bonds can't be paid back, we still have to make good on them or else it'll hurt our credit rating. So why would we use moral obligation bonds that cost us a higher interest rate when we could just use general obligation bonds for a lower interest rate if we're going to have to pay them back
Because
anyway?
on general obligations, you've got to go before the voters.
Oh, God forbid.
Yeah.
God forbid we had to check with the voters.
And you also put in there Toys R Us. Toys R Us are another example of the pressure being put on, mostly by Amazon, on the retail world.
Sure. I think the deal with Toys R Us is, like you said, Amazon has put, I think first and foremost, Amazon has put tremendous pressure on them. That's a problem. We saw that same scenario with Benny's. However, with Toys R Us, you have an extra layer of added pressure, which is the private equity firms that were running the company were taking tremendous amounts of cash out of it.
What? A private equity group is taking money out of a company?
Doing what they
Cannot believe that.
doing what they normally do, which added pressure to pay back the debt, which now they cannot pay due to decline in business. So
listen, retail's got a lot of trouble in this country.
Yes, brick and mortar.
And you saw it with Benny's a couple of weeks ago announcing their closure. 31 stores, more than 700 full and part-time employees in the region. It's a significant. Are we ready to transition those folks who are getting laid off into new positions so that they can, be key parts of our society?
I hope so. I'm not sure, but I certainly hope so. And you point out Benny's, right? Small. Toys R Us, big, but it's not just companies like that. Walmart and Target are also under tremendous pressure.
Yeah.
Now they can obviously withstand it because they've got so much. They're so big and they've got so much of their own revenue. But they
very disturbing number, and I think wildly underreported is Walmart announced that they would not have any holiday hiring. In previous years, tens of thousands of part-time workers. They're going to allow their existing workforce with some additional overtime, but they are not hiring tens of thousands. So when that's if that's
Scary.
that's a big data point for the future of retail in America. Last one, there was listen, we enjoy it when it happens.
We do.
Last week, Jim Terracani, formidable, long-standing investigative reporter for Channel 10 and former GOP candidate for governor and founder of the Moderate Party, Ken Block, get into a schoolyard brawl on Facebook,
on social media,
and calling each other names, unfriending each other, blocking each other. These are two fairly respected, significant players
so it
in
can happen
politics
to any
and
of us.
media. What is wrong with folks?
I thought about this a while back, and I said to myself, I get into a political argument or an argument on Facebook, and can I recall one time that this has happened that I have changed the other person's mind, or that person has changed my mind? And I couldn't recall one instance. So I said to myself, no more arguing on Facebook because it's completely unproductive. So with that in mind, and I saw this little back and forth spat, I thought of that and I said, my God, people on social media just have to stop arguing with each other and just learn to coexist.
So obviously, a big part of our distribution structure is social media. We post a lot of stories, we promote it, we spend to promote it, and there's a lot of interaction. There's literally hundreds of thousands of interactions every week on GoLocal. And when we weigh in, I would say we post the story without editorial comment. If somebody's factually misrepresenting what the story says, then we'll put in sort of an editor's note. One of the reporters or editors will step in and make a comment. But it is fun to see, and it is entertaining from time to time to see these brawls. It kind of reminds me, in their own little bubble worlds, the Bill O'Reilly, Lawrence O'Donnell juxtaposition of them each having meltdowns amongst their staff. Tony, I may go off on you at any point this afternoon because of the hammering that's going on
But I
around
always
here.
like to have a kind of one offbeat kind of entry on the hot or not list. This was perfect for that, Josh.
Dead on.
Yeah.
Let me just ask you one
Sure.
last question before you head off. This issue related to how they're handling the PawSox process. Is this a good process? Is this a fair process? Do you think people will feel comfortable with it?
Just the way they held that first hearing, where it was 4 hours of folks who are in favor of the deal, and those who are opposed to it had to wait 4 hours to speak. I mean, someone reads that, or someone hears about that, or sees that, it's not going to incentivize them to come out and speak against the deal. So I think that, I'm not saying that it was that there was something nefarious going on, and the Senate said, let's pack it with the people that we like first, but it certainly looked that way.
Yeah.
So I think that the Senate needs to, or the people running the hearings, need to promote more diversity of opinion. It doesn't have to be pro-con, but let someone who's against it speak within the first hour or so, or the first half hour.
It's interesting.
Am I off here?
No, I don't think so. And there's a couple of people who are interesting. Gary Sass, I think, is undecided. He said he's undecided, but is worried about the process.
Right.
Mike Stenhouse, who I think is in favor, personally, as a former professional baseball player, and from a family, multi-generation major leaguers, I think he's in favor of it, but is also worried about the process as well. So I think that's the one aspect that could turn this thing sour. Russ Moore, always thank you so much.
All right, Josh, great to be
Hot
here.
or not, always
Thank
a
you very
great,
much.
and thanks very much.